Welcome to part 3 of Let's Play Pokémon FireRed. Today we're going through Mount Moon, but first I show off that once again my Pokemon's levels have increased because obviously I already went through part of Mount Moon and fought some of the trainers there, as I explained in part 2. I just thought I would repeat it one more time as a simple reminder. But without any further ado, it's time for our first cave dungeon. You know how in the tall grass you can see exactly where the tall grass is and where you will and won't run into random battles? Well, here you're gonna be running into random battles all the damn time! There is no tall grass here. Every single step you're gonna take here might trigger a random battle. Luckily, the way I'm handling this playthrough, we won't have to see that. I'm gonna keep repeating that because even though I already explained all of it, I'm sure somebody will bring it up even though I already explained it. Look, a Clefairy! Just like Jigglypuff, it's right now a normal type, but in Generation 6 will be changed to a Fairy type. Also, Clefairy can be found right here on Mount Moon, but it's also like a 5% chance, so if you do run into one, try to catch it because it might be the only one you're gonna find for a while. I mean, if you do care about catching Pokemon you're not even gonna use, like I do. Usually, not on this playthrough. And even if you do, you might need a little help with completing the Pokédex. What exactly do I mean by that? Well, I get into that in a minute, but first we have something else that wasn't in the original Generation 1. Well, sort of. This trainer uses a Pokemon that itself was in Generation 1, but it wasn't entirely the same in Generation 1. This is Magnemite. Magnemite is an electric steel type. However, steel type in the original Generation 1 didn't exist. It was only added in Generation 2. Magnemite was the only Generation 1 Pokemon who actually got his typing changed to a steel type. Well, Magnemite and its evolution. Now, because this is a remake of the original Generation 1, Magnemite is the only steel type we're gonna be running into, until the very end of the game at least. Also, he sends out a Voltorb, which is a Pokeball. And he's also just an electric type. Now, going back a bit, steel type wasn't the only type that was added in Generation 2, they also added dark type Pokemon. However, because no Generation 1 Pokemon got changed to dark type, we will not be seeing any dark type in this playthrough at all until the very end of the playthrough, just like with the steel types. However, even though we're not gonna see any dark or steel types next to Magnemite and its evolution, we are gonna see a few dark and steel type moves. Not many, but they still exist and they're still part of the type matchup. So later on I will also explain the type matchup when it comes to dark and steel types. But in the meantime, let us talk about our new party member Venenum over here. He has Poison Sting as ability, so now Voltorb is poisoned just by touching him. But his only attacking move right now is Peck, which is a flying type move, which is not very effective against electric type Pokemon. His other two moves right now are Leer, which lowers a target's defense, and Focus Energy, which increases the critical hit rate. Critical hit is a small random chance of an attack doing more damage than they normally would. Some attacks have a higher critical hit rate than others, and Focus Energy makes it that every move that Pokemon has a slightly higher chance of dealing a critical hit. So this is probably the only time you're gonna see me use Focus Energy, just because I don't find it that useful. However, you can use it in combination with the move we just learned, which is Double Kick. Double Kick is a fighting type move that will always hit twice, but because its attack isn't very high, it won't be that much more effective than any other attack with just higher attack. However, because it attacks twice in one turn, it also has twice the chance of triggering a critical hit. But because Venenum is now at low health, I decided to show off using an item, for example a potion, in the overworld. Go to your bag, select it, and select the Pokemon you want to use it on. Simple. But anyway, earlier I was getting at something, how if you want to collect every single Pokemon in the game, you might need a little help. You might also notice that I keep saying Pokemon Generation 1. That is because Generation 1 of Pokemon had multiple Pokemon games. So time for a little history lesson. The first Pokemon games in Japan were Pokemon Red and Green. However, the first Pokemon game suffered from being very glitchy among other problems, so they fixed that and made it Pokemon Blue version. But the Pokemon Blue version in Japan also had some minor changes from the Red and Green version as to where which Pokemon can be found. So when they did release Pokemon games outside of Japan, they used the basis of the Japanese Blue version, but used the Pokemon locations of the Red and Green versions. Then later they also released the Pokemon Yellow version, which is pretty much still the same game, but with changes to make it look like that game was following the storyline of the Pokemon anime. But it still doesn't answer the question to why do Pokemon always get two different versions of what's essentially the same game, Red and Green in Japan, Red and Blue in America. That is because the difference in those two versions is which Pokemon you can find. There are Pokemon you can only find in Red version and there are Pokemon you can only find in Blue version. For example, the trainer we're fighting right now, she has an Oddish and a Bellsprout. Oddish can only be found in red version, Bellsprout can only be found in blue/green version, and the same goes for the remakes. Bellsprout can only be found in leaf green and Oddish can only be found in FireRed. Along with some changes in how likely Pokemon are to be found. Viridian Forest in FireRed has a 10% of fighting a Kakuna and a 5% of fighting a Metapod, and then vice versa in the leaf green version. So not exclusive, but it means the other Pokemon are still in those other versions, but they're a lot harder to find. So now the question still remains of why did they make these two different versions with different Pokemon defined? That is because they wanted you to complete the Pokédex, and the only way you're gonna do that is by trading certain Pokemon with your friends who have the other versions. If you want to, you can buy a trading cable, 2 different Game Boys and 2 different versions of the same Pokemon game, but that's not what they wanted you to do. They wanted you to interact with other people even though it's a single player game. Pokemon was really about the interaction. They want you to battle Pokemon with your friends and trade Pokemon with your friends. Because next to the exclusive Pokemon, some Pokemon will only evolve to their final stage by trading the Pokemon. So another reason to trade Pokemon with your friends. And with that being the case, I think they did a pretty good job. Not for me, of course, because I don't have any friends that trade and fight Pokemon with. But I think it's a nice idea that they pulled off quite well, and they even still do it today with the 2 different versions, but now there are even more differences between the 2 different versions of the same generation games. So that ends our history session for today, folks. I hope you learned something about the history of Pokemon today. Back to what's going on screen, we are fighting a rather shady fellow. And I don't mean the Sandshrew, the Pokemon we're fighting, I mean the trainer. He says he's part of an organization called Team Rocket, and I don't like the sound of that. Oh well. Oh, and Sandshrew over here is a ground-type Pokemon. We saw Sandshrew earlier in the Rock Gym, which doesn't make any sense because it's not a goddamn Rock-type! Actually, Pokemon Generation 1 suffered a lot from that. They didn't have enough of certain Pokemon types, so especially not to use them all at the same point in the game. Like, there are other Rock types in the game, but you're not gonna use them all at the first gym. So they went with a different early game Pokemon, which is close enough to Rock, I guess. Though the biggest Generation 1 offender of that is the Ghost type Pokemon. Like, there is a type, Ghost type, but there's only 3 Ghost type Pokemon in the entire game, and they're all within the same evolutionary line. So, Ghost types in this game barely exist. Anyway, new Pokemon, this is Zubat. It's a poison flying type and they're infamous for the fact that you're gonna be running into them in the caves all the damn time. It barely matters what generation you're playing. Zubat also brings another interesting thing with him, because he evolves into Golbat and then Golbat evolves into Crobat. However, Crobat wasn't introduced until Generation 2. And because this remake is trying to follow Generation 1 as close as possible, when your Golbat is about to evolve, it will suddenly stop. So you know, it can evolve at that point, but for some reason doesn't happen. It can only be evolved after a certain point in the game where you're actually introduced to Generation 2 Pokemon, which is technically already after beating the game. And I think Golbat is the only case where this will actually happen. Oh look, a Star Piece. Star Piece items don't really do anything, but you can sell them in the shops for lots of money. Also try to check on suspicious looking rocks once in a while, because occasionally they will have an item in them. And when I say suspicious looking rock, I'm talking about their placement, not the rock has a suspicious look on his face, because that's probably a Geodude. That's something a little weird about the world of Pokemon. We have rocks, but we also have Pokemon who are rocks. We have trees, but we also have Pokemon who are trees. And look, it's another goddamn Rattata, or Rattata, or however you pronounce this name. You know, I don't usually bother with the pronunciation of Pokemon names, because everyone has something different. After a while you just give up on there being a right or wrong pronunciation. So fuck it, pronounce the names however you want, and if someone says like, no, that's wrong, you should pronounce it like this, and then that's just how they think it should be pronounced. So there's no right or wrong here, they're just names, they're not even actual words. Like even normal human names have different ways of being pronounced, even though they're spelled the same way. So I don't want to hear anyone bitch about Pokemon pronunciation, because it's Pokemon. You know what, I'm just gonna use that as a standard excuse, because Pokemon. And this trainer's gonna send out another Zubat. Wow, I'm not even having any random encounters and I still get sick of the fuckers. Actually, I really like the final evolution Crobat. In fact, if I could use Crobat throughout this game, I probably would have used it. Speaking of Crobat, the only way a Golbat will evolve into a Crobat is when you max out its happiness or its friendship stat, which is another invisible stat that Pokemon have. It is basically how much a Pokemon likes you, and it can be increased in a number of different ways, like winning battles with that Pokemon or walking around with that Pokemon, having it in front of your party. There are like 2 moves that are affected by how high your Pokemon's happiness is, but other than that, the only reason you're doing it is because certain Pokemon can only evolve when their happiness is maxed out. In fact, the only reason it was added in Generation 2 in the first place is because then they had an excuse to make Pokemon that couldn't evolve in Generation 1 now can evolve in Generation 2. Hey, a suspicious rock, I found an Ether. Ether is an item that restores the PP of a move. And there's another item over there, but first we have a suspicious man, or we can just walk around him and he won't do anything until we get into his eyesight. Like now. Now we can fight him. You can pretty much avoid a lot of trainers just by not getting into their line of sight. But some trainers are required to fight because you can't get past them without walking in front of them. Also, not all trainers have the best peripheral vision, meaning you can walk fairly close in front of them without triggering the battle. But usually when I really try to avoid a trainer, I just stand as far away as possible. There are also trainers that walk around constantly, but you can tell their pattern and tell when they can and cannot see you. And in later generations there are trainers who stand still but constantly turn and not a specific timing. So you have a window of opportunity to walk past them, but if they happen to turn at that moment they see you and then the battle gets triggered. And sadly, because our main character is a mute, you can't just tell them to fuck off. And another Ekans. We already saw this guy earlier, but what I didn't mention is that Ekans is exclusive to the red/FireRed versions, whereas Sandshrew is exclusive to the green/blue/leaf green versions. So I'm pretty sure they're supposed to be their version exclusive counterparts of each other, because they're also found on the exact same roots of their respective versions. Just like the example we saw earlier with Bellsprout and Oddish, Oddish is found the exact same roots as Bellsprout is found on the leaf green versions. Along with the fact that both their final stages of evolution require a certain item, just like Ekans and Sandshrew only have one evolution. And both of them evolve at level 22, so those are ways in which you can tell that they are supposed to be version exclusive counterparts of each other. In fact, a few of the version exclusive Pokemon are the reason I'm playing FireRed instead of Leaf Green, even though Leaf Green is the one I grew up with. I just happen to have a preference of some more of the FireRed Pokemon. And we just found a Moonstone, which is an evolutionary stone. Evolutionary stones can be used on specific Pokemon in order to evolve them to their final stage. And we can actually use this evolutionary stone fairly soon. However, I will not be using it fairly soon because I don't feel like it. Because when a Pokemon you have a stone for evolves from its first to second stage, you can immediately use the stone to evolve it to its third stage. But then we never get to see the second stage, and I kind of want to hang on to the second stage just for a while, just to show it off, because it's kind of mean to, hey, you just evolved and now evolve again. So there are gonna be a few moments where I have a stone, but just don't use it because I don't want to. But for those of you who care, Moonstones can be used to evolve Jigglypuff to Wigglytuff and Clefairy to Clefable. Along with 2 other Pokemon in this generation, but technically we haven't met them yet, even though technically we have met them yet. Why am I being super shady about this? Because I don't want to tell you those 2 Pokemon just yet, because it would be a miniature spoiler, not story wise, but for this playthrough wise, but whatever. People who know what the Moonstones can be used for know exactly which Pokemon I mean and why I don't want to tell you. But aside from the 2 Pokemon I'm just sort of not telling you, there's also a Generation 3 Pokemon which it can be used for by the name of Skitty, and a Generation 5 Pokemon it can be used for by the name of Mana or Muna or whatever Pokemon pronunciation. Also, we keep fighting more of those Team Rocket fellows, and because they all act like dickwads, I'm just gonna assume they're someone evil and we need to stop them from whatever the fuck they're doing. Actually, they're looking for fossils. I don't know exactly why that is evil, but they're jerks. And because they are jerks, we can only assume that they have evil intentions. Also, they wear black uniforms, and their original Generation 1 sprite actually had whips, and whips are evil. Not a Rattata, so I'm using my rat/mouse Pokemon, except mine is superior because he has marketing on his side. Pikachu used millions of dollars. And now Mascot is dying. However, its endless line of action figures will live on forever. You know, any sane player would just switch Pokemon at this point, but not me. I just get one more attack in and then let the Pokemon faint. Mostly because I'm just not very worried about running out of Pokemon and having to go back to the Pokemon Center, automatically of course, and then having to do the cave all over again, because I know I'm near the very end and I'm not gonna run out of Pokemon. Even though it would be better to just switch Pokemon, because then you can still heal it outside of battle. Because when a Pokemon faints, you can't heal it with a normal potion anymore. You have to use a revive, which are slightly more rare and slightly more expensive. So don't be like me and try to keep your Pokemon like alive, I don't know. Also, other people would make sure to just have a party of 6 Pokemon by this point, but I don't like to split the experience between the Pokemon I'm not going to use for very long anyway. So that is actually the better option, but I don't recommend it when it's your first time playing that Pokemon game. We're still fighting another Zubat, by the way. Fun fact, Zubat can learn the move Mean Look. It doesn't have any eyes. It is implied that Zubat looks at you funny. Oh, and Squirtle just reached level 16, I wonder if that's going to mean something. And by that I mean I'm bad at foreshadowing, and it is going to mean something, because, hey guys, it's our first evolution! Always an exciting thing, seeing your Pokemon grow up. I'm so proud. Except we now sort of have to deal with this awkward teenage phase before it fully grows up to its final evolution. Because starter Pokemon always have 2 evolutions, and they're always reached by certain levels, and there's no branching paths, no weird methods of evolving them. But yeah, Squirtle just evolved into Wartortle. By the way, during the evolution animation you can always press B to have it stop from evolving, and it will always try to evolve the next time it reaches a next level. And then of course you can always press B again, and there are a few reasons why you might not want to evolve a Pokemon right away with the case of a certain few Pokemon, because some Pokemon learn certain moves sooner as opposed to their evolved forms. And then there are also evolved Pokemon that don't learn certain moves at all when their pre-evolution can. But then again, there are also evolved Pokemon that do learn Pokemon moves without their pre-evolution doing so, so when you don't evolve them right away, they completely miss out on that move. So how are you supposed to know which Pokemon learn which moves when? Well, you look it up on the internet, and that's about it. Back to what's going on screen, we are fighting a Grimer which just used poison gas, which without doing any damage it does instantly poison us. So it's kinda like Thunder Wave but with poison instead of paralysis. And by the way, I sound like Elmer Fudd from time to time. I'm haunting Grimus. Also a moment ago Grimer used Disable, so the move we used right before he used Disable, we can now not use it for a few turns anymore. And like an idiot, I'm also using fighting type attacks against him, even though he's resistant to fighting type attacks. But at least fighting types aren't weak to any of his attacks. I mean, the resistance makes sense, because I wouldn't really punch a ball of goo. And another poison type, this is Coughing, which is supposedly based on a smoke bomb, which has a face, which is kinda goofy. Just like, I'm gonna blow up. And I'm still fighting him with a fighting type, mostly because I know I'm near the end of the cave, and I don't care if he dies for like 5 minutes, then I go to Pokemon Center and he's right back up again. Oh no, Mankey. Oh shit, I only have 1 Pokemon left. I still don't really give a shit. I know I'm gonna make it, so... Oh, another thing. Whether attack is normal effective, super effective or not very effective, that is hinted at what sound the Pokemon makes when it gets hit. I mean, I would explain what the sound sounds like, but I don't really think I can do that, because normal effective sounds like and not very effective sounds like see, not very helpful. Oh, and he also sent out an electric type against my water type, so then I went like shit. And thus I demonstrate the use of a revive. You use it on a Pokemon and it restores 50% of their health, regardless of what their maximum health is. So then to bring them back to full health you still have to use another healing item, but it takes up another turn unless you're not in battle, but then it still takes up another item. But later it turned out that was absolutely pointless because Aqua never died at all. So I also just wasted a revive because this is the last battle of the cave. But it never hurts to be safe. By the way, after running out of Pokemon and having to go back to the Poké Center, everything you did still would have happened. So you need to go back to where you were, but all the trainers you fought still would have been fought. But now that we have defeated that trainer, we can choose one of these fossils. These fossils we can, minor spoiler alert, later turn into Pokemon, so it's just another reason why you can't collect every single Pokemon on your own. I don't really care which one I choose, because I know I'm not gonna use either of them later on anyway. And he chooses the other one. By the way, you may have noticed that all the trainers have different types of categories. The kind of trainer they are also kind of hints at what kind of Pokemon they're gonna use. For example, that guy was a super nerd. Super nerds always use Pokemon that you would find in like a city setting. Bug catchers will always use bug type Pokemon, and female trainers will use like cute looking Pokemon. And of course there are many others which we'll be seeing later on. In the meantime, if we go up and to the right, we get introduced to move tutors. These guys will learn your Pokemon certain moves. So they're pretty much exactly like TMs, the only exception being you can't really pick them up and take them anywhere to save the TM for later and use them regardless of where you are. If you wanna teach the move to the Pokemon, you always have to go back here. I just give my Pokemon a move of them just to show them off because I'm not really gonna use those moves for anything else. Like the TMs, they can only be used once. Actually, starting from Generation 5, the TMs will be able to be used multiple times, as many times as you want. The move tutors will also, but they require certain payment, which is not necessarily money, but other kinds of payment. You need to give them like a certain item. But these guys can learn us Mega Punch and Mega Kick, and I don't really remember what exactly those moves do. They sound like fighting type moves, but if I remember correctly, they're actually normal type moves. And I give one to Mascot because why the hell not? Oh, and another thing I don't think I've brought up before, but a Pokemon can only have 4 moves at a time. So if you want to learn a new one, you have to choose another one to forget. So that's kinda important, I should have brought up earlier. Also, these guys aren't trainers, but if you do see a trainer with that same overworld sprite, it's probably gonna use fighting type Pokemon. But yeah, move tutors, they're pretty much like TMs. And speaking of TMs, we just got the move Roar. It doesn't do any damage, but it forces the trainer to switch to a different Pokemon. So that can be useful if you're like fighting a Pokemon that is strong against your Pokemon and you don't feel like switching Pokemon right now, you just make sure it sends out another. It will also fail if the trainer doesn't have any other Pokemon, and if you use it in the wild, it will just end the random battle. But regardless, we are now in Cerulean City and at the end of part 3, so join me next time in part 4 when we go over the Nugget Bridge. Hope you enjoyed this part and see you in the next one. Goodbye.